Okay, well, I see folks are streaming in by the second. We've got a lot to discuss here and only an hour to do it, so let's go ahead and get started. Um, Thank you all so much for being here. Hello and welcome. I'm very honored to have been asked to moderate this event. My name is William Lawrence. I'm a housing and climate organizer from Lansing, Michigan, and also the host of the Hegemonicon podcast at Convergence Magazine. And I'm a friend of the Climate and Community Institute, which is the host of this event on what's next for the climate left. The Climate and Community Institute is a progressive climate and economy think tank, creating cutting edge research to rapidly and equitably decarbonize the economy by focusing on material benefits for working people. I'm glad to be joined by four esteemed panelists. Johanna Bozua is the executive director at the Climate and Community Institute. Olufemi Otaiwo is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University and a fellow at the Climate and Community Institute. Thea Riofrancos is a professor of political science at Providence College and the strategic co-director at the Climate and Community Institute. And Batul Hassan is the labor director at the Climate and Community Institute. And you're going to hear about each of their work and expertise as we get into this conversation. I see we're up well over 100 people in attendance and still more people joining by the minute. So thank you again for being here. I'd like to begin this dialogue by putting this moment here at the end of 2024 in the context of the last 15 to 20 years of climate activism. Over the last year or so, I've been kind of provoking people online with the observation that the climate movement I grew up in doesn't quite exist anymore. And I want to explain what I mean by that. From at least around 2007, which is when I got involved as a teenage activist, the climate movement was conceived as an alliance of young people, environmental justice communities, indigenous organizers, big green environmentalists, labor unions, and green businesses. All of these constituencies, the thinking went, could find a common interest in halting fossil fuels, building renewables, and limiting carbon in the atmosphere. And the logic of the climate movement in those years, I think those of you who are around would agree, was to coalesce all of these diverse constituencies under the unifying banner of climate action. I remember we said at the first People's Climate March in 2014, it takes everyone to change everything. But now, following the Biden administration and the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, it appears to me, and I want to ask our panelists about this, that the interests and emphases of these different constituencies are now diverging. Very few people are acting anymore as if climate change is inherently a unifying threat, or that by invoking climate change, we can inevitably bring people together. Ajay Singh Chowdhury really captures this feeling in his recent book, The Exhausted of the Earth, where he writes in his first chapter, we are not all in this together. I certainly don't feel like I'm in this together with even some of our former climate movement members and coalition partners. The former groups that made up the climate movement are getting pulled in different directions as their concrete interests diverge. It seems to me that labor unions and green capitalists are bound up together in the project of green industrial policy, disagreeing on their relative share of the profits, but agreeing on much else, with neither showing much interest in making a broader offensive against the fossil fuel industry in pursuit of full decarbonization. Environmental justice and indigenous organizers have, in many cases, felt burned by the process of negotiating the Inflation Reduction Act and appear to be, in many cases, backing away from climate world alliances as a source of power and solidarity. And today's youth organizers, who 10 years ago would have shown up in the political arena as single-issue climate activists, are now showing up in more ideological garb as socialists or communists or anti-imperialists. And to be sure, there are still people who would call themselves climate advocates first and foremost. But it appears that their numbers are fewer and that message isn't carrying the same mass appeal in today's politics. Meanwhile, of course, the biggest goal that we've been fighting for over 20 years, to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, is slipping from reach as emissions and warming continue unabated. So for all of these reasons, I wonder if we're here today as members of a climate movement. I'm not clear on what the climate movement is at this moment or what it should be. But we are here, at least, as people who are burdened by the knowledge of climate change, who have spent decades working to understand it, and who know, as well as anybody, maybe better than most, what climate change has in store for us over the decades to come. So we're also here, of course, as members of the political left. So I want to return then to the question that is the title of this event. What's next for the climate left? And maybe I'll pose it like this. Is the path forward to reconstitute a self-proclaimed climate movement as such? And if so, what are the constituencies that could be organized to rally together under the banner of climate action? Or is the path for climate leftists to integrate into other movements, such as the socialist movement, the labor movement, the tenant movement, etc., and to make climate a foundational plank of these struggles? So no small questions. We'll get started with that one, and then we'll move on to some other big questions. But I think I'm going to kick it to Johanna first to open us up.
Thanks, Will, and thank you so much for thinking through these questions and moderating. I mean, you always bring the best questions, and you've started with a really hard one that made me think a lot prior to this conversation, and one we've been mulling over at Climate Community Institute. And one of the things I was thinking about was that the realities of the climate crisis have changed over the past 15 years, that, 10 to 15 years that we've been doing advocacy, at least myself personally. And while the impacts were very real a decade ago, they're just nowhere near the scale that we face today. Massive wildfires in California and the West are just like now the norm, with particulate matter that's making its way all the way from the West to like a New York City school child's lungs and making it hard to breathe. And, people are losing their homes to these wildfires. And then also hurricanes, floods, so much more regularly. And even my own home state of Vermont, which is not really the state you think of for, extreme weather or hurricanes, has been just decimated now multiple times from flooding and landslides. And even bridges I knew as a kid have just been washed out enough times that they're not rebuilding them right now. And our economy has created this experience of a working class unraveling in the US. We have these just like unending working hours. We have this ever-growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Rent is just hitting extremes. And all of this is really adding to this feeling of atomization and isolation, so that like the extremes of our ecological systems are paired with the extremes of our economy and creating this just like what feels like unending cycle of harm that's, sending people into these kind of like this dystopic reality we're living in also is like helping to facilitate emergences of fascism. So as a movement, I think we have to think about the shifting reality and consider how that means that our tactics or our strategies shift and change. So from my perspective, I think we have to take climate policy and decarbonization and enter it into this broader struggle for progressive economic populism. We need to be able to communicate and develop smart, simple policies that materially are going to change people's lives on an everyday basis. And when I am saying things like economic populism, I want to be very clear. I'm not just focused on accruing benefits to the white working class. I think that we're talking more about the vast majority of people who are living in the United States. And honestly, internationally, right? Since we are so connected to that. And one interesting thing, we were talking with some of the folks at Data for Progress the other day, and they did these polls at different points throughout 2024 to evaluate voters' perceptions on top issues. And they found consistently that it's like inflation, high grocery prices, jobs that were on the top of the priority list, whereas climate was lower down. And what that tells me is not that we shouldn't be like tackling the climate crisis, but that people are trying to survive high rents and like high grocery prices when they go to the store. And and the truth is that that climate is directly tied to people's experiences. It is like those wildfires and those droughts in California are affecting the food prices. And floods mean housing costs are going up, and wildfires mean that you have to stay inside and you become more isolated. So thus the point of entry or activation for climate organizing can and is different in some cases. It's not just people who are on Cancer Alley who are confronted with, petrochemical and fossil fuels, but also the tenants in New York City who are trying to survive electricity blackouts during these like more persistent and consistent heat waves. So the the piece of the story that you were telling, that does still feel right and compelling to me of the past decade of the climate movement is trying to open up into this more intersectional, like multiracial coalition of like figuring out how do we bring labor to the table with indigenous organizers. I do think that there is something to that, and I think we'll get into this in our conversations. I just think that more climate advocates need to be more deeply embedded in the constituent movements like labor, like tenants, like debtors, like local organizers, and for our focus to be really focused on, where climate and economy match. So that, and doing so in a way that we're building for the known benefits of those investments, and we're naming the collective villains that we have. May it be big banks, fossil fuels, like landlords, and another reason I say this is just because I think the climate movement is not going to be strong enough on its own. And that's like part of the reason for this embedded approach. And I think we can actually learn from what you mentioned at the beginning here of the coalition that fought for the Green New Deal and ultimately helped to deliver the Inflation Reduction Act, because we were able to build power. Like that did happen. And that was alongside the more progressive and like stronger progressive movement. And we were able to advance an agenda around climate, but we were like not strong enough in that moment to ensure that we didn't drop some of the core investments that would have made the policy stickier in my mind, like major housing investments or, making sure that the programs aren't going to be moderated through a tax system that people don't understand. So, I think ultimately what that meant is that we, as you mentioned, like there was this kind of left edge that was ultimately sacrificed, environmental justice that didn't maybe come through to the extent that we had the people who were working and organizing around the Green New Deal would have wanted. It also brought these all of the above vibes that we now have in our politic of like, oil and gas quid pro quos for renewables and like those types of sacrifices are, I think, part of the reason why we have a weak climate left right now, or a climate movement more generally, because it's like we got ourselves disjointed after that win. And so we didn't have the mobilization that took us into that kind of next level of governing. So I think at Climate Community Institute, we've been thinking a lot about this. And one thing that we did to try to like make those connections between what people are experiencing, what they care about in this moment, to the climate crisis is we wrote this piece called Seize the Future, which tries to link these kind of kitchen table issues and like political economic crises that we're having and like showing that they are connected, in fact, to the climate crisis. We have 4 different pillars that we dig into, and it is available on our website. That's, 1, bringing down costs, 2, supplying good jobs and infrastructure, 3, ending forever wars, and 4, preventing disasters and protecting migrants. And like, as you see, like none of that says climate exactly in it, but climate is the undergirding like thing that we are trying to tackle in each of those component parts. So, I think that there is a way to reconstitute that's going to look a bit different from how we came at our coalition in building, and it is probably going to take time. But I think, and it will take more embeddedness in these kind of working class constituencies and formulations that maybe the climate movement hadn't been as embedded in before.
Thank you, Johanna. I want to ask another question to help us take stock of the current balance of forces and players in the field talking about these issues. Thea, you've done some really impressive work to help us understand the role of green capital, how they're positioning themselves in our politics and economy. So I wonder if you could give us a summation of the state of green capital now in the United States in particular, and how they're positioned in relation to these changing political tides as we enter a second Trump administration.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. This is maybe in some ways very much like the complement or the other side of the coin to Johanna's answer. So I think it's a good place to go next. I use the term green capitalism, and I know that that can be controversial on the left because there is no such thing as sustainable capitalism. And I agree with that. I mean, I don't think that there's a capitalist system that can fully internalize environmental externalities. But I also think that it's worth holding on to the term green capital and green capitalism to get really granular and specific about a set of industries and supply chains and firms and investments that are definitely, making changes on the ground, right? So when I use the term green capitalism, I'm going to be an annoying professor and just like start with some definitional work. Because it is, as I said, like a contested term. What I mean really specifically is economic sectors and supply chains that have been labeled as green. And we can definitely keep the scare quotes around that because of their role, whether it's a proven role or an unproven role in addressing the climate crisis. And that could take the form of decarbonization or adaptation. So when I think about green capitalism, I think about everything from solar panels, which I think, have a proven role in generating renewable energy, to speculative geoengineering, which has no proven role, but is labeled as green because of its role in a kind of mix of I guess we could call it because its role in adaptation. So that's what it means economically. But I think green capitalism, and this maybe gets even more to our point, is just as much a political project and a kind of bid for political hegemony that's not successful yet. But that doesn't mean that it's not important or that it couldn't be in the future. And the political project is a kind of worldview in which profit maximizing firms combined with business friendly public policy are going to lead to kind of like a technocratic management of the climate crisis, that we're going to get market driven innovation, we're going to get de-risked and profitable investments. And it's a kind of, just so story of how capitalism is going to save us from the climate crisis. But it's very much a political argument for that. So I think that with those definitions in mind, there's a couple of things we can say about how green capitalism might mutate and evolve under the incoming Trump administration. And like one is to be really clear that when we get to that granular level of investments, of firms, of supply chains, green capital and fossil capital like become a lot less distinct. And I think this is really clear in some of the stuff I happen to work on, which is extractive sectors, but it's also the case in the hydrogen industry, in the emerging economy of what's called carbon management. We see a lot of overlap, like fossil fuel firms investing in those sectors, combined ownership, across those sectors between fossil and green capital. And then we see firms that are literally both, right? Like what do we call an auto company that produces traditional cars and electric vehicles, right? Or what do we call an energy utility company that provides both renewable and fossil energy, right? So there's a lot of kind of combination of green and fossil capital. And the second is that, like, I think a few years ago, I don't know if I want to use the word optimistic, but I think I had a bit more of a sense that, like, as the energy transition took momentum, that we might see actual like opposition between green and fossil capital. Like we might see tensions between those capitalists, which we might expect if like we were actually phasing out fossil fuels. So there was like a losing incumbent industry and we were actually substituting them with a rival, set of energy sources of renewable energy. But as Johanna very nicely explained, like we're not in that type of energy transition. We need to fight for that. And I'm not like saying, we've lost that, but what we have right now is what's better called a process of energy addition. And what that means concretely for green and fossil capitalists is that everyone can expand their investments and their profits. Like if you're adding both new fossil fuels and new renewable energy to the mix, like there's a lot of opportunity and it's really just not a zero-sum game at all. And there's, maybe I'll get a little more towards like what this means strategically for us as the climate left. What that means politically is that there's a lot of coordination tacit and but also increasingly more like explicit coordination between green and fossil capitalists in terms of how they interact with the state. Like we saw this with the IRA, which had a lot of benefits for both fossil and green sectors, which itself actually helped to cement the political alignment between green and fossil capitalism. And then we also have this kind of general kind of promotion by the Biden administration and previously by the Trump administration of energy security, which again redounds to this kind of all of the above. And both green capitalists and fossil capitalists can frame themselves as like contributing to energy security. And so just to kind of wrap up, like what will actually happen under Trump? I think a lot of this is going to continue, meaning like the politically savvy and just to be honest, like less principled parts of green capitalism, the firms and investors that are really willing to play ball with a Trump government are going to figure out that they need to hitch their wagon even more to the fossil fuel sector. And that's going to be easiest in sectors like energy transition related mining, carbon capture, hydrogen, where there's a lot of technological and financial overlap with the oil and gas sector. We're going to see coordinated pushes for deregulating permitting, again, under like an all of the above, like we should just have more energy abundance type of idea. And we're going to see, and this is maybe almost one of the most concerning things, like a lot of like kind of patriotic, nationalist, hawkish, like America first language being used by green capitalists to like ingratiate themselves to Trump or to a Republican Congress. That being said, and I'll end with this point. I don't want to make it sound like there's no distinctions between how green capital and fossil capital will fare under Trump. I think that for sure EV sellers and solar panel sellers might face some headwinds and dampen demand for what they sell if Trump is going to eliminate like subsidies and rebates for some of those goods. And we could be in a situation, I'm kind of riffing on a CCI report of more lithium mining, but less electric mobility. Like we might ramp up extraction, but actually see lower EV sales, right? And reminding ourselves that those extractive sectors like export to global economies, and they may or may not rely, on US specific demand. And I think just the last thing to say is that a lot of this balance of forces really depends, honestly, on the elephant in the room here, which is Musk, and like whether he decides to prioritize Tesla's fortunes or SpaceX's fortunes, right? And like what he's willing to give and take as he plays this unfortunately very pivotal role in the Trump government.
Thank you, Thea. That was great. This next question is, I think, going to be going first to Batul, and it's another question about the once and possibly future climate coalition. In the work I've done in this space, trying to build this big tent of the climate movement, it was often the case that indigenous organizers and labor unions, rightly or wrongly, felt like two opposing poles in the dialogue around strategy and specifically as it pertained to fossil fuel extraction, which is one of the key issues we're talking about here. Indigenous climate organizations have often been the most comfortable opposing all fossil fuel development, while I've encountered most unions to be highly uneasy opposing any fossil fuel development. Similarly, indigenous groups have often been trying to turn our attention to the long view, the 500-year perspective, while labor unions have often tried to turn our attention to the immediate pragmatic considerations around party politics, Democratic Party politics, and the immediate balance of power. Now, I think we're in a moment where labor has been ascendant on the left, and everyone here agrees that labor needs to be a pillar of the left, including on climate. But I want to ask if how you've experienced these tensions, and if you think the indigenous perspective about the long view, the necessity of refusal, and also the ethical responsibility to care for the earth is getting lost as we all move towards the pole of labor under that former big tent.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that in a lot of ways, the way that we understand climate justice at CCI and across the climate left should be as sort of an umbrella that encompasses all movements, and that absolutely includes both the labor movement and the indigenous movement and indigenous solidarity. So Thea sort of referenced some of our work on energy transition mineral mining, which I think is where we've been working on this most explicitly, but I hope it's a helpful example for gesturing towards the sorts of coalitions that can be built. Um, so much of our work on energy transition minerals, like lithium in particular, started out by trying to answer tough questions that are often posed to divide the indigenous movement from sort of our status quo or typical approaches to decarbonization. So pitting the indigenous land defenders, indigenous people here in the US in particular, against not just the labor movement, but also the climate movement, by claiming that by opposing these mining projects, they were opposing decarbonization, or climate action, that was painted as the absolutely only way to do it. And so we know that the majority of mining projects around the world are located within like 30 miles of indigenous or peasant land. And as the US is onshoring more of this energy transition mineral mining onto domestic shores, we're no exception. And so over the last few years, we've been doing research to show that there are actually alternatives to what's being proposed by the industries that Thea characterizes as green capitalists. Um, we can build smaller electric cars. We can invest more in transit instead of highways. We can build denser cities. We can think about transit-oriented development when we're building housing to address the housing crisis. All of these things that we can do can reduce the amount of mining by more than 90% by 2050. So that's a huge reduction. That's 90% fewer mines that would be if we rethink the way that we get around in this country. Um, and under status quo conditions, the majority of these minerals that we're talking about are being mined for personal EVs or personal electric vehicles, which for us was a way to sort of think through the cross supply chain opportunities for organizing across Indigenous and different sectors of workers, and people who use transit, of course. So what if we mined less and avoided the forever effects of that industry on the land and its people, protected Indigenous sovereignty, and started to think through what a new transportation system would look like if it incorporated and took up the demands of public transit workers for better working hours, for more job stability, for better pay, or shifting, for example, from a corporate-led, unplanned EV transition that we're going to see become even more chaotic under Musk's interventions in the next administration, towards a system that is not leading to crises for workers and communities at all these various scales, but actually is prioritizing the production of socially useful goods that we need that allow us to decarbonize more quickly. And these sound like abstract demands, but I think in a lot of ways in our work, and we see it happening more, we're starting to bring them together. And there needs to be more for sure. This isn't like a totalizing answer. We're thinking about it again and how we work on forest restoration that prioritizes benefits for communities, rural communities that have been left out, that starts to redress past harms, that prioritizes, livable wages, life-sustaining wages and working conditions that necessarily has to include traditional ecological knowledge too that comes from Indigenous practitioners. So I think that by starting with identifying a common enemy in a lot of places, so not just fossil capitalists, but also all of those capitalists who would undermine the rights and stability of people across the ever-expanding front lines of climate crisis, is where we can start first by identifying common demands and then building those into the connections for Indigenous and labor organizing.
Thank you, Betul. That's really interesting work to think on, and super helpful to give the example of the concrete case, because it seems as if if we just follow the winds of the world, we're going to end up getting pitted against each other repeatedly, according to where people are showing up in these fights. So it takes a lot of proactive effort to build the relationships, find the common enemy, articulate a different kind of solution, and then get people to actually go to the mat together from A to Z through the process. So thank you for your work to be building those relationships, and I'm going to keep thinking on that. This next question, I want to turn to Femi, who wrote a really excellent essay a couple years ago on the concept of security, called who gets to feel secure. And I've been sitting with this essay ever since I read it. And I've been thinking that, security, even more than prosperity, is the economic condition sought after by most ordinary people. We don't just need something now, but we need the security of knowing that we're likely to have it tomorrow and next year. And of course, climate change is a huge vector of insecurity and risk in each of our individual lives and as a society. So I wonder, Femi, to hear you elaborate on this, how we can develop a politics that is about demanding and providing security in insecure times.
Thanks for both the kind words and the question. So I want to start off by talking about how the climate crisis itself is distributing security. We know the global South generally, especially small island developing states, are facing wildly disproportionate climate risks, even within the United States, something that CCI has covered in a recent report that I will circle back to. Something like 40% of the people in the US live in a census tract with a climate risk that, in dollar terms, is worth 10% of all property value in the area. The median household income of neighborhoods that are facing one severe vector of climate risk is nearly $90,000 a year, but the median household income of communities that are facing 5 or more different vectors of climate risks, whether it's flooding or sea level rise or wildfire risk, compounding 5 different vectors of risk, the median income of those households is $60,000. So in general, whether we're talking geographically across the world or whether we're talking about a comparison of income brackets, poorer people, more working class places, households, and communities are at bigger risk for climate impact. And that is, of course, just looking at directly the rain and the fire and the sea level. But I think the deeper point is the one that Thea was getting to earlier. If we track the political trajectories, what are the kinds of politics we're being offered in the present moment, and who are those politics going to secure? And maybe just as importantly, what are those kinds of politics going to secure? The bottom line, from my perspective, and I'll go through a few examples of this, but what we need to see is that major institutions of capital, and to the extent that they have buy-in from state technocrats, what they're up to, particularly the wings of that are under the heading of what Thea's called green capitalism, what they're trying to stabilize isn't the climate at all. Right? What asset managers, what BlackRock, what fossil fuel companies, and arguably even, what solar panel companies are trying to stabilize are returns to shareholders, are returns to portfolios. And the hope from the eco-modernist, kind of technologically optimistic side of politics is that there's going to be an alignment between what it takes to stabilize return to those portfolios and what's good for the rest of us. But I think we have good reason to suspect that what is going to stabilize returns to portfolios does not neatly align the goals of corporations or asset managers with the broader public. And I think in some telling and troubling spots, it actually aligns their goals directly counter with the public. And to just list a few examples, there is the ongoing criminalization of climate protests, which is a way that activists have been trying to push our social systems to do more. Not only has climate protests been criminalized across the country in the majority of state legislatures, but the funding for the bills that criminalizes that protest is directly traceable back to organizations like ALEC, the American Legislative Executive Council, which has been a right-wing law factory for 50 years and is funded in many cases directly by corporations and certainly by foundations that have right-wing leanings. The development of Cop City in Atlanta is yet another demonstration of what the plans for capital and the state are, which has less to do with disaster insurance and has more to do with a militarized kind of social order insurance that is represented by the police and policing. And these are all downstream of the general orientation of capital to defending its own accumulation, that is being welded with our political process more generally. The economists Daniela Gabor and Dongo Samba Silla have been covering this on a global scale. There's an emerging consensus between the state system and capital, large banks, asset managers, that the state, the thing that is nominally supposed to represent the public interest, should take on the financial risks of shepherding capital into these energy markets, even the supposedly green ones. So the downside risks of changing the composition of the grid, for example, are to be borne by citizens rather than corporations. So all this points us to a model of risk taking and risk sharing where what's stabilized, what's protected are returns to portfolios. And the ways that those things are defended are by policing, are by criminalization, and are by, even at the financial level, a passage of risk from the rich to the poor. So what do we do in response to all this? I think there's a lot of ideas that are emerging from different corners. One thing that came out from CCI, a report headed up by a colleague of ours, Maura Burse, is the idea of having public insurance apparatuses at the state level, state housing resilience agencies, whose job it would be not only to insure housing, but also to take on some of the work of identifying risks that are mitigatable, climate adaptation steps that we can take to prevent the destruction of housing, to prevent the wildfires and the flood risks that are leading to climate vulnerability in those census tracts. That was the report I was referencing earlier. Activists have fought for the public to take on the responsibility, both financial and the planning stages of responsibility for public renewables. The Build Public Renewables Act in New York is something that activists worked hard alongside labor and alongside a coalition of actors to get passed at the state level in the state of New York. And generally, that's an ethos and an approach that we could try out with different institutions entirely. There's been researchers talking about the possibility of having public asset managers. So rather than BlackRock deciding what investments need to be safeguarded, there could be a public institution that owns lots of assets under management that could be directing capital this way or that way to make sure that investments get made in protecting communities and in increasing the rate of renewable energy adoption at a rate that is keyed to actually doing something about the climate crisis, not doing something about portfolio returns. There's a new book coming out in a month or so by Mike McCarthy called The Master's Tools, which makes a similar argument about green banking. If you had the right kind of democratic ecosystem, then maybe at a scale to south of public asset managers, you could still get publicly guided investment in the right kinds of technologies. But the theme that's emerging in all these different examples is there has to be something that is meaningfully politically responsive to and controlled by the public interest rather than private interests, rather than the interests of shareholders.
Thank you, Femi. There's like 5 follow-up questions that I really want to ask, and I just can't for the sake of time. So, because we have a whole world to take stock of, and so this next question will be turning to the international arena. Um, it would appear that the green industrial race with China, between China and the US, is over before it began. China has won, and the US will be the last to realize it. Um, Meanwhile, another story we've been following in the last couple of years is that countries of the South are absolutely crying out for debt relief in order to fund the costs of the green transition, but they're not receiving it. And we've also been continuing to witness absolutely unbearable live stream genocide in Gaza, which none of us, through our various movement activity, have been able to stop. So I wonder, as we enter these next 4 years, what are the necessary positions for the climate left in the US to be taking on great power conflict, militarism, and North-South relations? Beginning with Thea.
Yeah, this is such a vital question and very, very close to my heart. And I think it can't be overstated just how concerning and conflictual and just outright bloody the global arena is right now. As you mentioned, we're in the 14th month of an escalating genocide in Gaza that's completely enabled militarily, financially, and ideologically by the United States. And honestly, and I'm going to just do some real talk right now, like we have seen very little on this from climate organizations, right? There's very few exceptions. The Climate and Community Institute, and I think Batul will talk more about this in a moment. We've really like been clear about our stance on genocide and ceasefire, and what justice would look like. But really few other climate organizations have really been clear about that. And so that itself is concerning, and I think something that we should discuss more. At the same time, we're seeing another concerning trend, which is the growing alignment between the national security state and its sort of anti-China hawks and green capitalists. And this alignment in some ways might have started under Trump, but it really took off under Biden, under the current administration, because he's much more explicitly than Trump did framed green technology supply chains as these kind of strategic battlegrounds for geopolitical dominance. And in the process, he in many ways successfully enlisted solar, lithium, wind, and EV companies into this Cold War. And that they have really rallied to accept that, at least in their own rhetoric and the way that they have cozied up to the government, even if it has some economic costs for them, that the benefits, economic and political, seemingly outweigh the costs. Just as concerning as that, back to the mainstream sort of climate world, we've seen a lot of willingness to accept what I would see as like a Faustian bargain, despite the fact that the new Cold War with China has clearly negative implications for global climate cooperation, and even on the more like strictly economic front, carries a lot of downsides for mass deployment of crucial energy technologies. If you're erecting tariffs and decoupling, that it complicates the sort of economic proposition. But I want to move more quickly to like what is to be done right now, because I think that was like the spirit of Will's question. I think there is an opportunity for the maybe, reemergent climate left in this moment. With Trump's return to power, I think it's incumbent and really necessary on people that identify as progressive internationalist climate advocates, like the people in this panel and probably like people that are attending this event, to not shy away from sort of the global scene and to make a renewed case for the dangers of tying the energy transition to geopolitical security politics, like to recognize the danger of that and to lay out an alternative vision that aligns a domestic energy transition with global economic and political justice. I think the dangers of this tight, unfortunately, right now, kind of tight alignment between the energy transition and geopolitical or geoeconomic issues will become clearer to leftists and liberals with Trump in the White House. Like, it's no longer the case that you have to think, oh, maybe I could get access to the Biden government if I kind of make these concessions on geopolitics. Like, no, there's no access to the Trump White House for climate folks. So I think we can be much more clearly kind of oppositional to geopolitical conflict and instead articulate a much more full-throated internationalism. And I want to just like close by saying that I think the word internationalism gets thrown around a lot, including, I'm doing it right now, but it's not just a word, right? It is an actual concrete practice that Climate and Community Institute and other folks have been very engaged in, of actually like building and solidifying relationships with partner organizations in the global south, right? Diffusing knowledge. And I want to be clear that it's a lot of like global north folks, like learning from successful tactics and strategies in the global south, where the battle with the climate crisis is like really severe, as Femi already laid out. It's also about tactical coordination across borders. And I think just in our analysis, it's incumbent to just be much more rigorous about how the climate crisis intersects with the global political economy and all its inequalities, exploitations, but also all of its possible opportunities for solidarity.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I can jump in. Cool. Yeah, thanks, Thea. And I'll touch a bit more on Palestine. And I think my reflection for this panel in particular is that I think we've all probably heard some of the discourse that posits like the climate movement as an arm of the left or of the progressive movement that lost energy or attention over the last year or so because those activists who have time to commit to movements shifted to ending the genocide in Palestine. And I do think that like that's something that we need to be rethinking. The climate justice movement, if it continues to be a justice movement, really fundamentally has to recognize that war and the war economy is a defining feature, not a bug of the extractive economy. It's fundamentally impossible for us to decarbonize without demilitarizing. And those two things together are two like world historic tasks that need to be taken up together. At CCI, we did put out some research to demonstrate the emissions outputs of this genocide to date, which I think were helpful in some way. I mean, emissions aren't as my colleague Patrick Baker always says, emissions aren't the first reason or the 100th reason to care about a genocide. But I do think that they were helpful in demonstrating the asymmetry between Israel and Palestine. But beyond that, I mean, the climate left, I think, has begun to take up the fact that these military activities, military industries are meant to destroy. And beyond the explicit purpose that they have of destroying things, they also cause generations of irreversible human and environmental harm. So I think, like, as we were talking about earlier, just as we sort of need to build in the transition away from fossil fuels, a more solidaristic green economy where workers use the skills and tools that they have to build the decommodified, decarbonized systems that we know that we need to transition. We also need to be transitioning from a war economy to a peace economy where workers are also empowered to organize and build, to make and provide the socially useful, socially productive, healthy systems that we know that we need to stabilize our world, not to destabilize it further. And I also think on this topic, it's worth mentioning that this task will be even more difficult with the incoming administration. Like, as horrific as the last year, more than a year has been already domestically, we're already seeing attacks on environmental justice groups that have taken strong and correct positions on ending militarism and apartheid. Just a couple weeks ago, Climate Justice Alliance was denied their grant from the EPA, and these attacks are going to continue to escalate. So thinking about the climate left as something that is being rebuilt as we speak, I think it's incredibly important for us to be not thinking in a competitive way across movements, but really thinking more solidaristically about what it means to protect groups that the incoming admin sees as most vulnerable and are going to be the least likely to be able to generate any kind of widespread defense. And that goes for Palestine activists to migrants to trans people to women, and obviously to frontline communities, which include all of the above, right? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We've got 11 minutes left, and I'm trying to squeeze in two more questions. bringing it back home here to the US, after the election, there's been some chatter about, the overall demise of American civil society and social life and the isolated conditions of our existence, which we know are also fostering right-wing values among the public. And many people, I think most of us would agree, that rebuilding the left requires, on some level, a more intensive focus on each of our local conditions, the people living and working around us, in order to build the sort of social fabric that is conducive to our values of solidarity and shared fate. But the risk here is that we retreat into a pure localism that vacates the national arena, as well as the responsibilities of international solidarity. So I wonder, I think Johanna and Batul maybe have some thoughts on this. How can we do better base building work and community building work locally, while also coordinating more effectively at the national and international levels? I think we can do that all, but it requires a different way of approaching all of that work holistically. Maybe starting with Johanna.
Yeah, thank you. And another tough one to answer in such a little bit of amount of time, so I'll try to be quick so we can hear from others as well. Will, I'm going to answer your question and it'll be a silly answer. I'm going to say we need more pools. And the reason I say we need more pools is I think that we do need like joy and like actually being connected to the infrastructure that we're fighting for. If I think about the Harris campaign, she came out really strong with that like commitment to joy, right? Like it was all about joy. But the reality is that like that joy was somewhat hollow. It wasn't tangible. And like people felt that. Like it didn't actually change their lives. It wasn't backed up by the infrastructure that allows us to have joy. And I think we see in this moment of the climate crisis that actually pools are not only a place where you get to like go swim in the summer, but they're actually like integral to making sure that you're cool during the summer. And we've seen so many of those cool pools closed because we just don't have the like parks and recs budget to keep them open. And so I actually think us finding those places that like we can mobilize people understand what's at stake and like the value, and like bringing that joy in at the local level can have so many positive ramifications. But it has to be connected to this like larger political project, right? And I'll say that the New Deal and like the folks who are organizing around the New Deal actually kind of understood this too, and saw it not just as a bottom-up project, but by one where like you need to be investing kind of federal money. So the New Deal built 750 pools in 5 years. And it became really integral to that social fabric that they were able to build. And they also wrote like, this was built by the Works Progress Administration every single time, right? Like they said, like, we did a good thing and we want you to know about it. And I think that it's about finding those places of alignment in which local organizing is building towards and like creating a blueprint for national infrastructure, and we can shout it from the hilltops at the national level, and then try to create and fuse this relationship between both culture and infrastructure and policy making, as well as the local to national level. And actually, I think we have a lot to learn from international examples of how they've been able to constitute these type of policies that connect up anti-fascist organizing, climate, and like building a political project. So yes, a funny answer, but I think, looking to pools as an example of how we build in a multi-scalar way.
And figuring out how to make organizing genuinely more joyful in a dismal world where people have every incentive to tune out and just log on to Netflix or whatever. I do think that there's another part of this, which is making the fight more actually joyful, not like what they had going at the DNC. So thank you, Johanna.
Exactly.
I'm going to move to the final question because I want to hear from each of our four panelists, which is, okay, time to put your cards on the table. What do you think is more important and less important over the next 4 years? What are our priorities? Because we can't actually do everything equally well. So some are going to say it's about defending against Trumpian attacks on people and institutions. Some will say it's preparing to defeat Trump at the ballot box. Some may say that it's tilling the soil for a progressive agenda in 2029. Should we defeat Trump in 2028? Some will say it's putting all of this aside and focus either on the local or the international. Time is scarce. What do you think is the priority? Beginning with Femi.
So I think that what the broad view that I have on this actually follows up really nicely on what Johanna just finished saying, because I think in the next few years, we have to put together a coalition of people that recognizes climate interests as their objective interests. And as of now, we maybe have a critical mass of people that would answer a survey question to that effect, but I don't know that we have a group of people willing to strike on the basis of that, or a group of people willing to succeed or fail to support a candidate on the basis of that. And so I think finding ways at local and regional levels to make it clear to people that there's something in it for them if they develop a climate politics, and doing that in a way that's key to climate justice and not just climate technocracy will set the stage for significant internationalism, significant later stages down the road. But I think that looks like stuff that's cool. I mean, literally cool, but yeah, that's what I think.
Um, Thank you for this huge question that we each have 1 minute to answer at the end here. But, I guess I want to kind of like remind us of something that I've been thinking about recently, which is that the Green New Deal originally burst onto the political stage during the first Trump government, right? And I think that's not to say that there's some mechanical relationship between Trump being in power and a huge mobilization for a Green New Deal, but it is to say that like things can happen when you're in the opposition. And being in the opposition, both in its like parliamentary and extra parliamentary sense, is something that I think we should think about. Meaning, like, our role is not just defensive resistance, as important as that might be. We, I think, on the left that are active, that spend a lot of our time doing what we're doing today, like, need to go on the ideological offense while the right is in power and kind of not shy away from that. And then I think, secondarily, and this kind of picks up like threads from lots of stuff that folks have already said, like, be really concrete about where we can still push and organize progressive climate politics. Because, like, a GOP trifecta in a country as large and diverse and with as many terrains of climate organizing as exist in the US and beyond, like, does not rule out progressive climate policies. Like, it doesn't rule them out at the state and local level. It doesn't rule out green bargaining, in labor union campaigns, something Batul has worked a ton on. It doesn't rule out, thinking about ways to align the kind of growing tenants movement with climate politics. It doesn't rule out internationalism or campus politics. Like, there's a lot of terrains of climate organizing, and I think we need to like do the spade work to kind of insert ourselves in those places and build relationships in those places, but also kind of, continue to be intervening on the kind of quote national political stage with ideological offense, with like what our policies will be once like maybe Dems are in power, right? Like, and I think kind of moving on those two tracks is what I'd like to see.
Thanks, Thea. Let's pass to Batul and then to Johanna.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I've also, Thea, been thinking a lot about like the Green New Deal introduction, also the Red for Ed strike wave that happened under Trump, and sort of the resurgence of more militant labor organizing that was possible in extremely unfriendly organizing contexts, but did happen and were extremely urgent and set off sort of a wave of mobilization. And also thinking about how one of the ways we can connect sort of the local to the international is through these kinds of campaigns. So like in a school setting, like organizing for reasonable class sizes for English language learners is something that's going to be incredibly necessary in our climate future. And is also builds muscle to be able to fight for more when it comes to decarbonization at a local and community level. But yeah, I mean, my answer to this question, I think, is that whether it's at the local or the national or international level, as the climate left, we have something that the Democrats failed to provide, which is an answer to an answer in a comprehensive worldview to explain the many different ways people are hurting from status quo right now. So Democrats tried to unite this corporate coalition with people who see their paychecks and their utility bills and their rent and their healthcare costs just vaporizing into those same executive salaries every day of their life. And it's killing us. And that coalition was rejected. And the right does this really well. It provides a worldview that people can take up and understand and use to answer all of these questions that are presented to them in their life. And I think our challenge now, as the climate left, is to step into this vacuum and be able to provide that worldview across the different terrains of organizing that we find ourselves in that has decarbonization sort of like grounding it at its core. Johanna? I'll pass to you.
Oh yeah, these are easy things to end on. Well, thank you all. And also just want to recognize that like Will, you were one of the like core organizers behind the work that was the Green New Deal. And like I feel incredibly grateful for everything that you were able to build that created the fertile ground for where we are today. I think like in many ways, CCI wouldn't be constituted as it is if we had not had the Green New Deal like advocacy and organizing that happened in, the 2019, 2018 era. But one thing I was thinking about in answering this question is last time that Trump came in, just similarly, I have been or like talking about nationalizing the fossil fuel industry for like the past, 7 years or something. And people would ask me like, why are you talking about nationalizing the fossil fuel industry under Trump? And the answer is like kind of the same as this time too, is that we actually have to have a blueprint for some of this stuff when we get in so we can actually mobilize. And I think sometimes we find ourselves a little flat-footed when we have power and we have to be ready to govern. And I think there are many modes and many different places to occupy, as my colleagues here have described. I think for CCI, that's what we're spending our time on is like, what is the mid-range commitments? What are we trying to do? What's the next like big project that we can detail out, test, and be ready for so that we can actually keep those material gains into that power going forward?
Thank you, Johanna. I think we're going to cap it there. We wanted to keep it mostly on time, and we mostly did. So thank you to our panelists for your just excellent words and all your perspective. Thank you to the 200 plus people who attended, and I was looking through the attendee list, and I just want to say that there's so many comrades, new and old, people who we've seen along the road over the last 15, 20 years who I see there. And I just want to say that like, all my questions about doubting where we are as a movement aside, what I know is it's the relationships we build and it's the thinking we do together along the road is like gold. And so if I just encourage everybody to stay in touch with your comrades, reach out to somebody that you haven't talked to in a while. These times of transition are really amazing for reflecting and also evolving our analysis. I know I'm not in the same place I was 5 or 10 years ago, and I don't think any of you are either. So let's just keep churning, keep in dialogue, keep processing. And I know that there are some amazing ideas we haven't even heard yet that are going to come out of the relationships we build, the study we do, and the solidarity we have. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a good evening.